Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. Very big week this week, including the single largest stimulus package in American history, totaling $2.2 trillion to stabilize the economy in the wake of the novel coronavirus pandemic that's devastated the world economy. More than 3 million Americans have filed for unemployment last week, an all-time record, and stimulus efforts now total more than $6 trillion. Joining us to discuss the package, the politics, DoD's response, and international reaction, and more are Ilan Berman of the American Foreign Policy Council, Byron Callan of Capital Alpha Partners, Michael Herson of American Defense International, a leading Washington, D.C. lobbying firm, Terry Schultz, Brussels-based journalist who reports for Deutsche Welle and National Public Radio, and our very own Chris Cervello, a retired United States Navy commander who's a key part of the Defense and Aerospace Report team. So, Michael, let's start with you. Give us your take on what this package means from industry. Byron was kind enough to join us on the daily podcast yesterday and sort of give us that first sense on what is called the CARES package. Talk to us a little bit about where we are, what lawmakers are saying, and especially, the GOP opposition, which was actually remarkably fierce and furious. Lindsey Graham being one of those who was pushing back against the unemployment benefits included in this measure, which a lot of people would have argued is one of the most important features of this, given how many people are going to be losing their jobs or have already lost their jobs or have already been furloughed.
Oh, and I think it's a good point. It's funny, too, that Lindsey Graham also had tweeted earlier in the day, hey, let's get on with it and pass the bill. But as members are starting to realize what's in the bill later on in the day, he started to have some issues with the unemployment section. Obviously that got straightened out. But let me back up. So, look, the bill is not only $2.2 trillion, but it's also well over 850 pages. It really covers a broad variety of things, but there's obviously a lot of implications for the defense community, funding as well as on the policy side. Now, the funding really is primarily directed at battling the COVID-19. There's $1.4 billion for the National Guard. There's $1 billion added to the Defense Production Act. There's $3.8 billion for defense health programs, which also includes $415 million for research and development for the military medical community to research vaccines and treatment for antiviral medications. There's $1.5 billion for the expansion of military hospitals and expeditionary hospitals, not only to alleviate the strain in the civilian healthcare system, but also possible strain that could result in the military healthcare system. And of course, they couldn't help but add in there some transfer limitation to make sure that the president doesn't take any of this money and send it over to the border wall. There's $17 billion for loans or loan guarantees for businesses critical to maintaining national security. And that's getting a lot of attention because there's a feeling that a lot of that money is going to end up going to Boeing. Even though other defense companies will have access to that money, it's a feeling that Boeing will get a very large share. And there's already, some grumblings among the defense community about that. But there's some key policy measures in this bill, too, because the defense community was really lobbying for key defense policy measures that are really going to help them maintain cash flow and liquidity, give them some contractual relief, give them some tax credits for maintaining their workforces. I mean, that was really a push beyond looking for a help with platforms. And the defense community got that. I mean, they got some really good contractor relief in there. And the things that were not in the bill are things that the DoD has been stepping up and sending out memos on a regular basis. There are some things that they're looking to get more, and we'll talk about that later when we talk about Stimulus 4. But now that the bill's passed the Senate, and there was some drama leading up to that. I mean, we expected a vote early yesterday. We did not get the vote until later in the day because they were working out some problems. Not only the fact that Lindsey Graham was opposed to some of the unemployment sections, but Bernie Sanders was also raising issues that he was unhappy about. And if Lindsey Graham got his changes, Bernie Sanders was going to be opposed to the bill. But now, the battle moves on to the House. And prior to the vote, which it was clear it was going to pass, was coming out, Senator Schumer released a Dear Colleague to the other Democratic senators, which really was reflective of the partisan tone that was taking place in this whole process. And it was very in some respects, blistering toward McConnell, really saying that McConnell presented them with a partisan bill that was written exclusively by Republicans, that the bill fell short. But here are the things that we were able to get in there as a result. And this progress would not have been possible if we had not rejected, what McConnell was putting forth. And I think a lot of that language does not bode well for future supplementals. And there was some tit for tat in there. I mean, the president did ask for $3 billion to fill the strategic oil reserve. And Schumer touts it as a victory that it was a bailout for big oil. Well, look, if we're going to bail out the aviation industry, we're going to bail out other industries that are impacted by coronavirus, oil industry has been impacted by that as well. It does affect a lot of people in Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and is important to our national security. And at the same time, the Republicans fought adding extra money to help the Postal Service. Well, if we can't get mail delivered, especially to rural areas that count on mail for prescription drugs, that's going to be a problem as well. So there still are other issues that are going to bleed over. Yep.
And one of the things worth pointing out, though, right? I mean, oil prices are low, right? I mean, so if you're going to fill the oil reserve, you might as well fill it and get the most oil you can for the buck you're spending, right? I mean, so there is some sense there as well.
Exactly. So now the attention turns over to the House. So the House of Representatives is going to convene at 9:00 on Friday to vote on this. There's going to be 2 hours of debate because they're going to do a voice vote. And so there are members coming back. Very few, but there are members that have already been here in D.C., and there are some members that are coming back. And this, by doing it under voice vote, it will allow members to go to the floor and voice publicly their opposition to the bill, because there are some that oppose it, and others that will come in to voice their support for the bill. And then once the 2 hours passes and they then ask for a voice vote, the drama will be, will somebody call for a recorded vote? And if they do, that will force Congress to have to fly back. And that is very complicated because we have at least a dozen members of the House in quarantine. More and more members are getting sick. Katie Porter now is sick, waiting for test results back on coronavirus. Seth Moulton of the Armed Services Committee, he and his wife, both sick but can't get tested. Ayanna Pressley now is saying that she's sick. Since our last podcast, Senator Rand Paul tested positive. Senator Thune is now ill. And there will be members that also won't be able to get flights to get back here. And some that get here might end up stuck in D.C. And then obviously there's going to be a fair amount that will be afraid to travel back here. So the spotlight's on a few folks on the left and the right. Obviously, AOC on the left is a concern. She is here in D.C. She has expressed opposition to the bill. And then there's folks on the right, like Louis Gohmert and Thomas Massie, who also expressed opposition to the bill. But I think everybody's hopeful, when all said and done, that people will voice their concerns. The bill will pass by voice vote. And by doing it by voice vote, they are actually allowed to enter into the congressional record members who aren't here, how they would have voted had they not been here. So people can get on the record their opposition and appeal to their base, and we can get on with this, and the president will sign it right away. Go ahead.
And well, I was going to say that's a very elegant political way of allowing something that's important to go through, while at the same time allowing anybody to vent their spleen if they want to and be able to protect themselves come November.
The question is, how long is Congress out for to then come back and deal with another stimulus package after this? President Trump has said he wants to reopen America come Easter, which is only 3 weeks away. However, the District of Columbia mayor, who really controls the city, has closed all non-essential businesses through April 24th. Congress now is planning coming back sometime in the middle of that, sometime I think around April 20th, but that still remains to be seen. I've been talking to a lot of members of Congress over the last couple of days, including today, both Democrats and Republicans, and they're starting to see some of the strain on the DoD and how some of this money is now going to start to roll out, with hospital ships being deployed to both coasts. The Mercy has finally left port in San Diego on its way to LA. The Comfort is going to leave in 14 days out of Virginia to head to New York. Army field hospitals are being ordered to New York and Washington State. The Army Corps of Engineers is converting hotels and dorm rooms in New York to medical units. More than 8,000 National Guardsmen have been activated. There'll be more. But now we see the virus spreading in the DoD. We see 60% cases are up 60% among active duty troops this week. Sailors on the Roosevelt have been infected, coalition members in Afghanistan. We see F-35 tests now being halted. The military suspended all travel and deployments and exercises. So there's a great deal of concern there. And again, you get back to this conflict where you have the commander-in-chief saying we're going to reopen in 3 weeks, and both Milley, Esper, and Brigadier General Paul Friedrichs, who's the military top doctor, all saying, hey, wait a minute, there is no timetable. This could take months, until we're back in gear again.
I want to go to Chris in a moment, but first I want to go to you, Byron. You were great in sort of the first blush analysis of this. Michael's done a great job giving us sort of the fulsome rundown of where we stand. Talk to us about what the implications are if, whether it's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or anybody, or Gohmert or anybody else, votes against this. Everybody will have to come back. The Senate has already looked at this as we've done our job. Talk to us about what the implications are. I mean, the market has been up on the sort of teasing notes that this is going to happen. What happens to the market if this doesn't happen? And what does this mean sort of going forward? Because I think that we're on, Michael, if I've got the calendar correctly, right, we're in recess until April 20. So this is potentially extremely problematic if we don't have a deal. Again, we're taping this on Thursday. Many folks will be listening to it on Friday morning. But just to indemnify ourselves, what are some ways to read this if things don't go the way that we hope or expect that they will go?
I would agree that, sure, markets have reacted very positively to the developments in Washington, D.C. And I think just thinking about this, 15 days ago, if you had told me that there's going to be the largest stimulus package in the history of the United States and it passes the Senate 96-0, I don't know if I would have taken that bet. So on one hand, you can understand the market's optimism. Maybe Michael has a view on this, but one of my understandings is Pelosi can actually take votes by proxy. I'm really not sure how the mechanics of that would work, but I don't know if you have to have everybody back in Washington, D.C. I think that's virtually impossible on that short a notice, given the reductions that you've seen in air schedules and airline schedules and even Amtrak schedules. And then you risk that exposure. You're going to risk exposure of members to further infection. So I'm skeptical. I think there's the usual last minute drama as we saw with this bill, but I really think, the market's kind of got it right here that this is going to pass on Friday. And then we have to start thinking about the fourth fiscal package. And that's probably where really some of the ideological or partisan fault lines are going to become more apparent. I think they really got tamped down in this bill, but when you start seeing these things getting crept in about fuel efficiency, carbon footprints, all these other issues, those may really come to the fore in the fourth stimulus package. And that might be a much heavier lift. It's also probably going to be more important because I think this bill, I think you could kind of look at it as a survival bill. I mean, it basically allows the healthcare system and the economy to survive for another month or two. Then there are going to be questions about, well, where are we with national infection rates? How's the healthcare system really holding up on this? Are we really starting to see the recovery in rudimentary things like testing? But that's going to be really the key. And then after this, to get the economy really up and running and kind of, kickstarting the engine of growth again, that's where that fourth fiscal package has got to play a bigger role.
Let me, Chris, I want to go to you in a moment, but Michael, let me go back to you on fiscal package 4. 3 million people have filed for unemployment. That surprised, I think, a lot of people. And Washington Post, just in the time that we've been taping this, has put out that, recession fears are running very, very high. Obviously, we've been using the R word on these podcasts for the last couple of weeks. What does package 4 look like? What are lawmakers telling you? Because you've been talking to them nonstop for the last, right, it's your job.
Well, Pelosi has already started to lay out some of her thoughts for package 4. So some of her key points are, a better definition of who qualifies for family and medical leave, healthcare worker and pension protections, increasing SNAP benefits by 15%, more funds to state and local governments, free coronavirus testing and free doctor visits and follow-up treatments. Then also equitable funding for DC, because DC was treated very differently in the bill versus is treated like a territory versus a state. She's going to continue to push for higher amounts of direct payments to Americans. I mean, her quote today was, "I don't think we've seen the end of direct payments." So, Stimulus 4 really worries me because of how partisan this fight got, as we got closer to, and we're still not there yet, the final passage. The Speaker unveiled her own version of the bill when she was unhappy with what the Senate put together. And there were, I think there's plenty of blame to go around on both sides. A lot of sides put things in their bills that really had nothing to do with battling the coronavirus. And the question is, after spending $2.2 trillion, how much money are we willing to spend? I think passage of a fourth bill is going to be much harder than the passage of the third bill, because I think Byron was spot on when he said that Stimulus 4 is a heavier lift, and the Stimulus 3 was a survival bill. Because it's exactly how this is viewed. Most members don't even know what's in this bill, and they're going to spend time in the next 12 months seeing what's in here. And I think there will be some momentum to try and fix some of the things that are in here that might be wrong or didn't have the desired effect in a Stimulus 4. And as far as the defense industry is concerned, what have been the impacts on defense and what additional strains have there been that we do need to address? And I got to give Congress and the industry a lot of credit. I mean, a lot of members of Congress are reaching out to me, wanting to talk to industry, saying keep the ideas flowing. They really want to know what problems they can solve. And OSD is pumping out directive after directive to try and deal with this as well. But it's your head spinning with so much happening. So I think the dust needs to settle for a little while, and cooler heads need to prevail. And I talked to a member of the Democratic leadership about this about an hour ago, about, hey, you gotta ratchet back the partisanship, and you really got to take a look at what you can do, not what you can't do, and really make sure that all the industries are getting a voice at the table, because a lot of people need relief, and it's not necessarily financial relief; it's just policy relief that they need. So I think we need to dust to settle. I don't see a Stimulus 4 happening until May at the earliest.
I want to add one thing. I think what this crisis has kind of shown is, maybe the sentiment was a couple of weeks ago, literally, wow, the stock markets are at record high and we've got a very low unemployment rate. And I think what you've kind of seen, this old notion that when the tide goes out, you see who's got a bathing suit on and who doesn't. And some of these underlying issues in the economy, the very low savings rates of the bulk of Americans, I think it's 41% couldn't meet $1,000 unanticipated expense without borrowing the money from friends or taking on credit debt. A lot of Americans just don't have high savings rate. I heard something today that something like 50% of the small businesses in the United States don't have more than 1 month of cash reserves available. So when you start peeling this back, there's a lot that I think, maybe to Michael's point, is going to get teased out in these discussions about there are some really weak points in this economy that there will have to be another fourth fiscal stimulus, but it's going to be very interesting to see how targeted it is at starting to get to some of those issues. And ultimately, if that helps building a more resilient economy, that should be good in the long run for national security.
Michael said that it's going to be a little while before we get to Stimulus 4. I know that financial markets have a tendency of looking for these things even further in advance, obviously, because so much of this is so important to them. Does the street have an anticipation of what tranche 4 looks like?
No, I think the street right now is really, and the market is, we've talked about this a lot, Vago. It's very hard to look at this on a day-to-day basis. And I keep pointing out, some of the biggest day-to-day moves you've seen in the history of the U.S. stock market have been in the midst of the Depression. I think what the market is very good at doing is when people in Washington, D.C. aren't necessarily focused on the problem, they're very good at getting all the pots and pans out in New York City and banging them together and screaming and yelling, there's a problem here, guys, you need to do something about it. So we saw the unemployment figures today. We've got to watch what happens with those figures in the next coming couple of weeks. Consumer sentiment, all these other gauges. And I think, if this thing has not started to turn a corner by, let's say, that week of Passover and Easter, the market's going to be banging the gong again.
Chris, let me bring you into the conversation. How would you gauge DOD's response? We talked to Acting Navy Secretary Tom Modly on Monday, We appreciate his time. At that point, there were 3 sailors on the carrier Roosevelt who had tested positive for coronavirus. But anybody who knows, has ever been on a ship, even if you try to practice social distancing, everybody's still on top of one another, fundamentally, to be able to do their jobs. And that had increased to 100 cases. And, especially for Pacific Coast ports and the San Diego-based Navy, it's been a little bit of a bigger challenge. Ellen Lord talked to reporters, the Acquisition and Sustainment Undersecretary, and faced a little bit of a tough time with reporters saying, look, DOD itself declared coronavirus a challenge on February 1st. Here we are on March 25th. And at this point, no defense contractor has been mobilized under the Defense Production Act to do anything, although Undersecretary Lord did point out that somebody on her staff had worked to put a car maker together with a ventilator maker, although there are people who are looking for more of a response. I know Michael gave a sort of an enthusiastic sense on where we are. Where do you think we are? Where do you think the Navy is in the military services in terms of getting their arms wrapped around it? Because one of the things about military services, whether you like it or not, you're in proximity to people and you have to execute the mission.
Yeah, I kind of came up with just a little scorecard here, and I'll run through it very briefly. I wrote down operationally, supportively, and rhetorically. I'd give DoD and the services a plus for operationally, even though they were late really across all 3 areas. But from an operational standpoint, I think that we know how to operate the forces in times of crisis. And for the most part, the forces are continuing to carry on the missions that they need to do in support of the National Defense Strategy and in support of COCOM tasking. I mean, the most obvious examples would be the 2 aircraft carriers that are in CENTCOM. While we have canceled exercises, I think that's been done out of prudence. We were able to execute a freedom of navigation exercise last night through the Taiwan Straits. The USS McCampbell carried out that freedom of navigation exercise. And I think those are important signals for both the force itself, for potential adversaries, as well as allies, that, hey, the US military is still doing what it needs to do. On the support side, again, being late, I would judge it as a push. They have not, seemingly have not really risen to the occasion in terms of executing the big things that I think people looked for them to do. There was the deployment of Mercy. There is the upcoming deployment of Comfort. But in terms of really turning loose the buying power of DoD in support of state and local authorities, they seem to be behind. Michael's comments notwithstanding. And then lastly, rhetorically, I would give them a mind. As you've watched some of these press conferences and as you've watched them try to communicate, it's almost as if they want credit for just showing up versus having something to say and being willing to respond to the hard questions of reporters. And I think that's what you were getting after when you talk about Ellen Lord's press conference yesterday. I think the secretary and the chairman, their press conferences have, while they've had news to put out, that they really haven't been able to answer some of the harder questions. I get that, and I think that just like the rest of government, they're behind. But I mean, as I look at those 3 things, plus in operations, a push when it comes to support, and then rhetorically, they could do a lot better.
Right. I mean, from a health perspective, you're dealing with, Americans that are above average in health. They're screened. They're in better physical shape. They generally tend to be younger. So the problem from a population standpoint is that these kind of things tend to be a little bit easier to control because they don't have the underlying diabetes or weight or other sorts of issues that have proven to be, high blood pressure. I mean, a whole bunch of other things that across the population have affected things. But part of the challenge is that the president is the one who's been sort of setting the tone. And so there's this sense that leaders in the other departments are all looking to the White House and what it is they can or can't say. So even though if you talk to people at DOD who will tell you that, look, we've been flagging this for an issue for some time, it matters whether the leader is open to other leaders in his organization also being willing to be sort of forward-looking. Ilan, I want to bring you into the conversation. Iran is one of the hardest hit countries facing this virus. It actually claimed, as you observed a couple of weeks ago, the health minister, during a press conference about COVID, and actually some remarkably senior leaders Iranian leaders have succumbed to the virus. At the same time, Iran continues its provocations regionally, continuing to meddle in Iraq with different levels of approval, depending on whether you're Shia or Sunni, and certainly at least fire at American forces on a regular basis. Talk to us about how this is changing the dynamic and the narrative, and adds pressure on an Iranian regime that already faces an enormous amount of pressure, especially after the shoot down of the Ukrainian airliner that caused a massive backlash against leadership.
Sure. Well, it's a really interesting time in Iran because domestically, it's very clear that the coronavirus is a Chernobyl-level event for the Iranian regime for a couple of reasons. First of all, because the Iranian leadership is uniformly old and infirm, and as a result, the virus is burning its way through the upper echelons of the leadership at an unprecedented rate. And the numbers tend to vary, but pretty credible estimates put the number of senior Iranian leaders that have succumbed to the disease upward of a couple of dozen, right? Which really begins to make a difference in terms of national cohesion and policymaking. But at the same time, the regime hasn't been able to muster anything resembling a national plan for dealing with the disease. They moved too slowly when, in order to limit mobility for the citizenry. This happened in Iran right around the time of the Persian New Year, at the just a few days ago, and the result was that in the country there was mass mobility among the population, which spread the disease. And so what you're looking at is a real seismic event happening within Iran. But at the same time, the regime has its priorities, it has its revolutionary credentials that it needs to burnish, which is why you see the Iranian regime acting very defiantly, rejecting assistance that's been offered from the United States and other countries. And there's really, I think, a real disconnect because the regime is trying to portray very robust image to the world, but it's profoundly ailing inside.
Do you think that it's something that is in jeopardy of collapsing the regime? And if that happens, what happens, right? Because regimes like this become the most dangerous as they're getting ready to tip over, causing a power vacuum and a whole series of unintended consequences, right? I mean, you can wish for the end of the Iranian regime, but ordinarily you'd like it to go away in a more ordered as opposed to disordered way.
No, I think that's right. What's interesting is that the coronavirus is actually, in a perverse way, deferring that day of reckoning, because before the virus broke out and before it became a pandemic, the Iranian regime was under massive pressure, not only from the outside, but also internally from a population that was increasingly disaffected, that was increasingly disengaged from the leadership. They were coming out in the streets, and now Iranians are not coming out in the streets. Now you have, sort of the Iranian version of social distancing, which is putting a damper on opposition protests within the country, at least temporarily. But the way the regime is navigating this crisis and the way the Iranian people are seeing it act very callously, reject international assistance. There's now reports that the Iranian regime misappropriated international humanitarian aid to the tune of something like $1 billion. All of that is something that's there will be a reckoning for it, but the reckoning will come later. So even if the regime manages to survive and stabilize somewhat and survive the coronavirus crisis, it is sowing the seeds of political turmoil later on after the disease clears.
Terry, let me bring you in because I know you have a very tight window before you've got to punch out to a press conference. First, we're very glad that you're feeling better. I know that it must have been terrifying for you and your son being at home and having a high fever and pretty much being told, hey, look, stay away from everybody. And
that's exactly right.
Good luck to you.
The story so many have. The same story as so many have. Can't get tested.
Exactly. Let me bring you in. I mean, this has been as devastating. I mean, Iran probably more devastated because of unchecked and the way the disease progressed. But obviously, this has been devastating for Europe as well. I mean, you're in Brussels and you were affected by it. Italy has been in complete lockdown. So is France, UK joining suit, disease being rampant now in Spain among the hottest hotspots. Talk to us about sort of where we are in terms of a European response and also the economic impact. The United States is reeling, as we've heard from our panel today. Talk to us a little bit about that impact and where Europeans see, and European leaders in particular, see this going.
Well, Brussels has been on lockdown. Belgium has been on lockdown also for now more than a week. We're also not allowed to leave our house except for exercise and with only your family members, and that police are driving around giving fines. So it is a really surreal situation because, which you may see soon in the U.S., but they are giving tickets of up to several hundred euros for people found in parks, even here in Brussels, even away from all other people. So it's really a crazy situation, and it's unclear what the economic consequences will be. EU leaders are right at this moment having a summit, and they're discussing, Corona bonds and things like this, and it doesn't seem like it's going to go through. But the biggest casualty, as so often, is solidarity. Today, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, gave a speech on the floor of Parliament, just absolutely blasting member countries for showing no solidarity. Up to this point, everyone has shut their borders. It's the 25th anniversary of the Schengen area coming into effect. And as of today, literally every member of every one of those 26 countries has reimposed border restrictions of some kind, some very severe. So again, the economic impact remains to be seen, although it will be absolutely devastating. But I think that the fear that people feel, and just the idea that you can't go anywhere and you can't trust anyone, and is really the predominant feeling here, as much as the economic trepidation, which is huge.
And one of the things, obviously, that's coming up in Washington, let me just broaden this internationally briefly. The administration has worked very, very hard to try to portray this as a Chinese virus, that it's a Chinese threat. And some of the president's supporters are hankering for either retribution or for Beijing to be held accountable for this. And the president obviously misses no opportunity to call it the Wuhan virus or to call it the Chinese virus. How are those efforts by the United States going to sort of affect not just transatlantic relations, but also potentially affect relations with China? Let me hear from Ilan and Terry, because both of you have got to go, and then the rest of us can pick up the conversation. Ilan, why don't you start us off?
Sure. Well, it's a good question. And I think what's necessary to understand is that the messaging from the administration, even though it's been blunt and it's been jarring, is intended to respond to China really trying to change the narrative about coronavirus. The Chinese have launched a massive propaganda effort to essentially to whitewash their complicity in covering up the crisis in the early days, and in depicting themselves as a constructive actor. And what the administration is trying to do, and we can quibble over how they're doing it, but is to try to set the table in a way that allows most countries to understand that the Chinese aren't blameless in this, that the Chinese are responsible for mishandling it, at least early. But the way they're doing it, the way we're talking about the Chinese virus, is, I think, too much of a blunt instrument, because it unnecessarily conflates the Chinese people with the Communist Party of China. And the real long game for the administration in policy terms, I think, is to try to demonstrate that the Communist Party of China, the Chinese government, is not a reliable actor, not a trustworthy actor. And I'm not sure that the messaging at the moment is getting to the crux of that.
To that end, the Chinese have been pretty effective at saying, hey, look, let's engage with Italy and Spain and countries all around the world to be the beneficent actor who's providing masks, gowns, and the like. But that rhetoric also has put pressure on Americans of Asian descent who find themselves discriminated against, because people are looking at anybody who might look Asian and say, like, well, it's your fault we have this virus. And we have friends who've said, like, I come from New York City, I have no idea what you're talking about, I have nothing to do with the virus. Terry, sort of give us your sense on how that's sort of playing in Europe, given that Mike Pompeo and the administration and a lot of analysts have even been warning European nations not to get sort of duped, if you will, by some of the Chinese messaging, even if they may benefit from some of those articles.
Well, I think that, I mean, Italy was certainly left in a really dark place by all of its European Union allies and neighbors. Nobody would send anything. They banned, Germany banned exports at that time. And so you can't really blame Italy for accepting gifts, although I think they paid for a lot of them, if not all of the supplies that were sent to them. I mean, who's going to turn that down in a situation like that? And remember, Russia sent in planes of supplies as well. So I think that, I mean, there will be a reckoning for this kind of thing later, but Italy was left absolutely alone and devastated. And I think that I don't think they're completely naive about why China's doing it. The charm offensive, that began with the Huawei, that or was well underway with Huawei, continues now in this horrible crisis. But also the Europeans just aren't as automatically suspicious, for better or worse, as the U.S. is. So they, for example, of course, wouldn't agree to this G7 statement calling it the Wuhan flu, and that held up a statement. The Secretary Pompeo was demanding it be called that. And so I mean, I think that's going to play out for a long time to come. And nobody's going to turn down those supplies under these circumstances.
And of course, Italy coming under pressure from Washington for being part of the Belt and Road, or agreeing to participate in the Belt and Road initiative as well.
Not just Italy, but lots of European countries.
That's true. Although that's come up, strangely. It's really funny that you say that, because some of the focus has recently been somewhat more on Italy than on others. Do you two have anything you want to add? Because unfortunately, both of you have previously scheduled things that are going to have to force you guys to move on. Ilan, Terry, any last words, and we can pick up the conversation from there.
Well, next week we've got a NATO ministerial, which will be held for the first time virtually. So we should be able to have some interesting conversations after that. That's happening on April 2nd, now completely by teleconference. So we'll have more to talk about. But I think it's been really interesting on my beat to see how NATO's joint assets are being turned to use for airlift, for example, of supplies into Romania yesterday and today. And I hope to be looking more into that. So maybe we can talk more about that next week.
Just to quickly follow up on that, there were some leaders, Fred Kemp of the Atlantic Council being one of them, to sort of say like, hey, this should be an Article 5 moment. Is there a little bit of that sense in Europe as well, sitting in Brussels, that there should be a little bit more of a concerted response?
No, I haven't heard anybody except Fred Kemp say that in an article. No, I mean, nobody has talked about that. I mean, remember that an Article 4 or Article 5 is a threat to an ally's territory, and everybody's feeling the threat to the territory. So I didn't hear that Italy was thinking of raising that at all. It hasn't come up in the conversations that I've heard. But I mean, it's interesting to provoke conversation about what's a threat. Right. What is a direct threat to an ally, but no, that didn't come up, and I would expect that Secretary General will get asked about it next week, but I don't expect it to be a genuine, really a serious agenda item.
Ilan?
Well, something that we haven't talked about, but maybe we can address more fully next week when the cake is already baked, is the fact that there are massive political changes taking place in Israel in the last, as we go to tape. In the last 24 hours, the Speaker of the Israeli Parliament, the Knesset, has stepped down. The blue and white coalition of Benny Gantz, which was supposed to be creating the unity government, has essentially split in half. Benny Gantz has said that he's willing to step in as Speaker for about 18 months before taking over the prime ministership. So Israel all of a sudden looks much more like there's going to be a sustainable unity government that's going to be able to prosecute this sort of broad national plan, not only to deal with the coronavirus pandemic, but also theoretically to have a sustainable government that sees the country through for the next couple of years.
And most importantly, from Benjamin Netanyahu's perspective, keeps him in power and away from indictment.
Well, he's been indicted, right? The question is,
from prosecution. Right.
No, he's been indicted. It's obviously very different. And being the, I'm not sure if I'm the only recovering lawyer on the podcast, but as a recovering lawyer, I can tell you that venue matters and where the case is heard while he's prime minister, whether it's heard in Jerusalem, which is conservative, or in Tel Aviv, which is where it would be heard if he was a private citizen, and it's a very liberal jurisdiction, matters a great deal for the indictment charges. So this is clearly a political win for Netanyahu, both in terms of his political career and also in terms of his potential legal exposure. He's got, he's bought himself another 18 months for sure.
Terry, Ilan, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Talk to you next week.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
And now a word from our sponsor. The Defense and Aerospace Report is brought to you by the Bell V-280 Valor, bringing the mission technology of the future to the battlefield of today. Visit bellflight.com for more. Let's talk a little bit about how this is affecting the political dynamic. Michael, let's start with you. The president's polling numbers are up from his standpoint. That's good, although it's not that big of a rise, but it's a rise among some. Chris and I spoke earlier today. One of the things that Chris was pointing out was that it's gone up with Democrats and independents, for example. Talk to us about how this is likely affecting a political race, especially at a time when Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders. I mean, but the most naive people thought Bernie Sanders was going to drop out. He's not going anywhere, and Joe Biden is coming across as being, Biden in the basement almost, right? And so talk to us about how this dynamic is going to play out, whether it's short-lived, long-lived, and moves a needle, because I think the president's rhetoric, especially when it comes to China, is driven toward his base by calling it the China virus, for example, as opposed to the coronavirus. Talk to us a little bit about, and Byron, want to get your take, and Chris, your take on how this is all going to play.
Well, obviously, this is all conjecture, but I think right now this is all short term. November is a lifetime away, but clearly this is hurting Joe Biden because he's not getting as much of a spotlight as he would normally get. And the fact that Sanders is staying in the race only hurts him. And, the vote on this stimulus gives attention to folks like Bernie Sanders and AOC, which does not help the Democrats. Although Andrew Cuomo has been doing an amazing job, and there's a lot of texting going on among politicos here in D.C. saying Cuomo for president, and that he's acting very presidential and he's looking like a presidential candidate for 2024. But that being said, look, the president's approval ratings are
politician thinking ahead to an election.
I know.
You mean that Nikki Haley dropped off the Boeing board purely on principle? I'm surprised. I'm shocked.
I know.
I'm simply
Me too.
shocked, Michael.
Me too. So
but
look, the president's polling numbers are up. I think it's it's a temporary blip. He's still not over 50%. He continues to appeal to his base, but the base is not enough to win a re-election. And again, this is all about the Electoral College. All we need to see are very small electoral shifts in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. We saw those shifts in the off-year election in 2018, where the Democrats ran the table at the federal level as well as at the state level. And I think that other states that Trump won are going to be very hard for him to hold on to, going to be contested, like North Carolina, like Arizona, like Iowa. So we still have a very long way to go. And as we get closer to November, people will be able to judge how well this crisis was handled. And I think the president doesn't do himself any favors by criticizing governors and state and local governments and telling them that in many cases they got to fend for themselves instead of being a unifier and acting like we are all in this together. And he may say that sometimes during his press conferences, but then he can't help himself and loses control over on his Twitter later in the day. So I don't think a lot has changed. I think people have their opinions of the president. They're not going to change. And I think a lot of people have their opinions of Biden and the Democrats, and those are going to be hard to change as well. So I think these are short-lived effects.
Byron, how do you see this all playing out, or is it just simply not all that relevant at the moment?
I agree with what Michael said. I just think it's too soon to tell. I know I saw some stuff that Carter's approval rating went up during the Iran hostage crisis, that Nixon's approval rating went up when he bombed Haiphong, and so maybe when he mined Haiphong Harbor. So I mean, maybe it's just a natural reaction that, oh, the president's actually doing something that's good. I don't know if it's really changed. I think to Michael's point, it's the real key here is going to be how it plays out in some of these key electoral vote states. and it's just too soon to tell. I mean, I could paint a picture where, coronavirus has been tamped down in the July-August time frame, and the economy is roaring back. And then in the Trump-Biden debates in September and October, Biden has some pretty weak performances, and Trump sails triumphantly into November. But equally, there's been a very devastating ad that's been run in a couple of states that just kind of strings together all of Trump's comments about the coronavirus as it's unfolded. I think they've actually tried to block this thing from being aired to no effect. And, there will be repercussions from this. And so I think it's just too soon to tell. Look, the Trump base, I don't think is going to change. I don't know what will change the passion that you see in the Trump base. And you can see the same in parts of the Democratic base. There are people who just despise Trump, and no matter what he does, it's not going to change. But I think we're going to know, to say the obvious, we're all going to know a lot more in kind of this August, September time frame, when I think more people, that fringe that really hasn't settled in might start to make their minds up. And that's going to probably be dependent on what they see in their day-to-day lives, what's happening in their families, what's happening in their jobs, what's happening in their lives, and how they feel about who's best capable of taking forward in the next 4 years.
Chris?
I agree with Michael and Byron in terms of the horizon. November is a long way away. I do think for the president, though, it is very much front of mind. The election is a lot closer in his mind than perhaps in many voters' minds. And I think you're going to continue to see his better and worse angels as a result of it. I think you'll continue to see the demonstrative behavior. You're going to use podium as much as he can to kind of play up the disadvantage that Biden and the Democrats have. I mean, and why wouldn't he? And the other part, as we talked about off air, I really expect him to continue to beat on the Chinese as a way of trying to not only play to his base, but to drum up some nationalism within those that are in the center that may be looking to blame somebody other than American politicians or American response.
Or his response directly.
Exactly. I mean, so that the more he can blame the Chinese, and if people buy into it, and as we've talked about before, the election is going to be decided by a small number of people. So all of this kind of factors together. And that is to say, I think that the next couple months are going to, not only are they going to be ugly from a health standpoint and from an economy standpoint, but they're going to be ugly from a rhetoric and a messaging standpoint out of the White House.
Do you guys, you know what, let me just take a quick pause because we've got to wrap up in the next couple of minutes. Chris, if you don't mind putting this, when I talk about the election, put that after Terry and Ilan. I think it flows better. We get their arc. We talk about China, and it kind of flows into this. And Michael and Byron, I mean, I want to kind of get your take on sort of Chris's point, right? Do you think that that's what's driving the president's calculus? Because he is a very focused politician and he wants to get elected. So at the end of the day, how much of that is the calculation that I can offload some of this? Because I have to tell you, with the president's base, that is working. I mean, it's several folks have told me, well, we called it Spanish flu because it originated in Spain. It's perfectly fine to call it the Wuhan or the Chinese virus, even though scientists would tell you 1918 is a long time away. We've called it SARS, we call it MERS. We tend not to, call it the New York virus or the Chinese virus in 2020.
But it can also really invigorate the anti-Trump base, particularly if they have Asian American friends, and this kind of is in some quarters viewed as a borderline racist, if not an outright racist label that's being applied, and it can backfire too on Trump. I mean, sure, it invigorates the base, but it can bring more people out against him too. So it might be a strategy that he thinks is going to work, but I'd be very, very careful when you start playing with stuff like this.
I agree.
Go ahead.
I agree with Byron 100%. And also, I think we should point out that the Spanish flu did not originate in Spain. It was because the Spanish were honest about the flu spreading, and the rest of the countries were not. And that's why it was called the Spanish flu, right? And I think honesty matters in national security, and truth matters, right? And I think, this has been a problem for Trump throughout his entire presidency, and it's a real problem now that he does the American people and the people who listen to him a disservice by telling them, flood the churches on Easter. It's okay to do this and this. I mean, he puts people's lives at risk. And I think it's a mistake, again, not only to call the virus a Chinese virus, but also the Wall Street Journal came out with a story today about how Xi and Trump have not spoken to each other since early February. And if we're going to mobilize a global response to this and work together and share information, the two of them have to be talking to each other. This
doubles back into the U.S. visibility at this point. I think it is intriguing. Somewhere I saw there was an image of a cargo crew unloading medical supplies from a C-130, an American C-130 in Italy, that we have been providing aid. But it's remarkable when you see these, like Cuba sending a flight to Italy, the Jack Ma Foundation, kind of boldly proclaiming they've sent aid, Jack Ma of Alibaba in China, that they've sent aid to 54 African countries. We're not playing this PR war well at all. And, that I think is the other dynamic that's at play here. I worry about it a bit.
Well, I mean, and we had, based on some erroneous information, unfortunately, somebody took, what was it, aquarium cleaner, drank it, and it unfortunately killed them under the sense that would be something that could address the virus. Okay, we've got a part. Any last thoughts, things you guys want to shout out or tell us that you're going to be focusing on for next week? Byron?
Well, I think it's significant, Vago, that the Army continues to push ahead with some of these major contract awards. A call out for both Textron and Lockheed Martin for winning the down select on the FARA program, the Future Armed Attack Reconnaissance Helicopter program, if I get that, aircraft program. I'm messing up my acronyms, but the FARA program is what they were awarded.
Michael?
Last thoughts I have are, Congress, despite the fact that they have been engulfed in the stimulus packages, are still focused on trying to get FY21 business accomplished. The committee staffs, even though they're working remotely, are still working on putting together the National Defense Authorization Act as well as the Defense Appropriations Act. The markup on defense authorization is scheduled for April 30th. That will likely slip. I've talked to members of the committee, but just because it slips doesn't mean it's not going to get done. There still is a push to continue and get these things finished, and they may have to give up some of the congressional recesses that were on the calendar in the future to get it done, but they still want to get their work done.
Cervello?
The number of cases across the military are going to continue to go up. I think the Navy will probably continue to be the service with the most cases. The announcement today out of DoD was that information on where and how many is going to continue to dwindle off because they view it as an operational security or a readiness issue. I don't think that's helpful, but I mean, it sort of is what it is at this point. As the rest of the country deals with this, so too will the military. So we'll have to keep an eye on whether or not that does have an operational effect, where thus far it has not.
You obviously served in the Navy. You have a lot of family who are serving in the Navy across the board. Sort of what's the sense you're getting from the force about how serious an issue this is?
I think the real concern is just in the initial lack of information, how this was to be handled. The Navy leadership, at least, and by all accounts, the other services have done a better job of getting information out. But I think that this will continue to be a problem. I mean, it'll continue to be a concern as that information is different from one area to the next or one base to the next. The lack of consistency is kind of what makes service members nervous, and that kind of makes families nervous. And so this will churn for a while, as it has across the country.
Guys, thanks very much for joining us. We appreciate it. Hope everybody stays safe and look forward to talking to you guys again next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vago.
Thanks, Vago.
And thanks for joining us. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DefAero Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report, and check us out on LinkedIn. And check out our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman and our technology report sponsored by General Motors Defense. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight, bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.